No one expected the century of blood to end with steam rising from a human cooking pot. But that was the moment the war truly began to die, when Elias Van Galley Cook from Earth walked into the palace of the enemy carrying a silver tray and the belief that hunger could reach where fleets never had. For 103 years, the Varick Dominion and the Solar Coalition had ripped star systems apart. Moons had burned, trade lanes had become graveyards, and every child on both sides learned the same lesson before learning math. The other species was not an enemy. It was a mistake. The Varick were tall, scaled, luminous under cold light, their voices like music over knives, and their Princess Lasara of House Saren had become the face of the war after her father died above the rings of Halcyon. When she called for a summit aboard the neutral station Orpheon, admirals expected a trap, diplomats expected theater, soldiers expected another massacre. Only Elias, standing in the coalition kitchens peeling roots for officers who never learned his name, heard the rumor and thought something strange. If they still demanded a state meal, then somewhere beneath all the hate, they still wanted to sit at a table when the executive chef collapsed during final approach. Elias was dragged from the lower decks, dressed in whites, and ordered to prepare something neutral and safe. But safe was the language of exhausted empires. Elias studied Varick court rituals, memorized their funeral customs, and chose the thing no strategist would dare. He would not cook for the summit. He would cook for the princess. When the doors of the Hall of Spears opened, every soldier expected a weapon. No one expected comfort. Princess Lazara sat at the center of a crescent table of black alloy, jewels glowing at her throat, guards behind her like statues made of starlight and contempt. Coalition delegates occupied the opposite curve, stiff with rehearsed calm, and between them lay a polished space wide enough for a funeral march. Elias entered alone with a tray so simple it looked insulting, a deep bowl of saffron broth, braided grain, marrow, mushrooms, sea herbs from Europa, and a round loaf brushed with citrus oil. No spectacle, no fire, just warmth. The Varick ministers recoiled at once, because this was not victory food or surrender food. It was intimate food, the kind offered to the grieving. One counselor rose in fury and demanded the human be removed, but Lasara lifted one hand and the chamber froze. Then she asked the question no protocol officer had prepared for. "Why does it smell like morning?" Elias should have lied. Every heartbeat in the room begged him to lie. Instead, he looked at the most dangerous woman in the system and said, "Because morning tastes the same in every language, Your Highness. When people lose someone, they stop needing spectacle. They need warmth. They need something that tells the body to stay a little longer." The translators carried his words across the chamber, and for the first time, Lysara did not look like the face of a war. She looked like a daughter remembering the silence after a funeral. She lifted the spoon. Dominion officials shouted. Coalition security reached for sidearms, and history balanced itself on the edge of one bite. She tasted it, and the room forgot how to breathe. The first change was tiny. Her hand trembled, her throat slowed. The ceremonial sharpness of her face softened by one impossible degree. She took a second spoonful, then tore the bread, then asked Elias where he had learned to cook like this. He answered that on Earth people fought over borders, spices and stories, but grief made them generous. They shared what comforted them because pain was too heavy to carry alone. Lysara stared into the broth and began naming what she found in it. The sea herbs matched a memorial broth from her childhood. The grain echoed the dish once served before enlistment feasts. The citrus oil carried the cleansing scent burned in Varick morning towers. Then she looked at Elias and understood what he had done. He had studied her people not to flatter them, not to manipulate them, but to recognize them. He had built a bridge from ingredients instead of propaganda. and in doing so, he had committed the most radical act possible in wartime. He had treated the enemy as people. Empires had spent a century trying to win with fear, and one human cook had arrived carrying understanding on a tray. The silence that followed was no longer the silence before violence. It was the silence of people beginning to doubt everything they had been told. The coalition foreign minister quickly invited the princess to name her terms. But Lasara ignored him and asked Elias another question. If I served this at a Varric table, would humans eat it? Elias gave a tired kitchen smile and said they would ask for more bread. A few coalition aides laughed before they could stop themselves. Then a few Varric attendants made the clicking laugh of amusement. The sound rippled outward. Awkward, disbelieving, but real, Lysara rose, lifted the bowl for all to see, and declared that no species capable of honoring sacred grief could be born without dignity. She called for a 30-day ceasefire, then 90. Then for the reopening of prisoner routes and civilian corridors. And because pride could not openly kneel to a soldier, a diplomat, or a gun, it bent instead before ritual, before witness, before the undeniable truth every being in that hall had felt. The war machine hesitated, then it began to lose its meaning. The ceasefire held, trade followed. Archives were exchanged, then funeral songs, then recipes. Because once both sides admitted the dead had been mourned on both sides, it became harder to keep pretending only one side had hearts. Months later, Lysara visited Earth under civilian stars, and the image that flooded the networks was not of treaties or fleets, but of the alien princess standing beside Elias in a crowded market, tasting street food from a paper tray and laughing. Scholars later argued that economics, attrition, and political exhaustion ended the war. Perhaps they all mattered, but ordinary people remembered it differently. After all the bombs, all the speeches, all the graves, the first real victory belonged not to the strongest hand, but to the one that offered a meal and said, "You two have lost. You two deserve warmth. Sit down, eat, live."